If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.
Hey everyone, John Williamson here, creator and host of Spoiled Fruit, Faith, and Power. I'm still hard at work on Season 2, which will take a broader look at evangelical movements as a whole. Because as we've seen, what happened within the Vineyard is in no way exclusive to them. These same patterns of power, control, and silence show up across the wider landscape of modern evangelicalism. But while you patiently wait for the next season, I wanted to share one of my full uncut interviews. Today, you'll hear from Pastor Brian Metzger, one of the most vocal critics of Vineyard USA's handling of cases like Duluth Vineyard. Brian's honesty, experience, and conviction have been vital in bringing these issues to light, and this conversation offers a raw, behind-the-scenes look at what really happened. So settle in. Here's my full interview with Pastor Brian Metzger. Okay. All right. So the first question I had for you is you've been keeping a really steady and beautifully detailed sort of timeline and of events, and you've been very obviously one of the pastors within Vineyard who have been very vocal about some of the events, not just isolated to Duluth certainly, but just in general in terms of how you've noticed that the Vineyard USA has sort of handled certain instances like this. And so what's the most recent on this? Like, what are you hearing from inside the Vineyard?
Well, it's really fascinating. We have people who, and I totally understand this, but we have pastors who are very happy with really like the most superficial sort of exposure to it, reading just kind of the bare minimum, if even that, kind of the headlines. And then we have, I would say, even some people who are just too busy. Like they just, they're just trying to keep their church open, or they're just trying to put out their own fires, and they don't have time or inclination to get into the weeds on some of these issues around the Duluth Vineyard or the reorg process, or how Vineyard USA has responded to Duluth Vineyard. And then on the other end, you have pastors who are able, for whatever reason, and interested in doing more reading, more investigation, asking more questions. And then, of course, everywhere in between in that spectrum. And so we have, pastors I've talked to who are like, hey, I'm gonna sign off on the reorg. I'm gonna do what I'm supposed to do, and then just, if something down the road goes off the rails, then we'll just get out of the Vineyard at that time. And I've tried to gently explain that once you change your bylaws and constitution to cede power to Vineyard USA, you don't get to just leave Vineyard USA anymore. It's not just up to your local church. Like, it's not just up to you. That's not how it's going to work anymore. And that just seems to be, something that people haven't really thought about, or they just don't even think that it's true. And some of it is in part because we have, as a movement, we have been very lax on constitutions and bylaws. A lot of churches that they're just now, because of this, putting together a constitution and bylaws outside of whatever they did for incorporation. And so they may not even understand how legally binding Constitution and bylaws is. And then similarly with all the things that have happened with Duluth, Vineyard USA has published kind of their own version of events, and they have published it at least a couple times a sort of a kind of an apology. It's not exactly hey, if you took this the wrong way, we're sorry. It's not quite as offensive as that, but it is an apology that's very non-specific. It's specifically non-specific, and it's about we and us. It's never about I and me, and there's really nobody to blame but our system. And thank God we're changing the system. And that seems to be really like all it has taken to satisfy people. I haven't talked to any victims who have been satisfied by that, but I have talked to several vineyard pastors who have been satisfied by that. So I think we're just in this really strange place right now where, we are, I think, really polarized, and still some people in between trying to figure things out. But I think by and large, if you're a vineyard pastor, you're happy and everything is settled and life is good. Why do we keep talking about this? And then the other side, the other extreme of, hey, the wheels are coming off, the house is on fire. Like how do we stop this?
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into the piece we were talking about before we started recording, which is like there's definitely feels like there's this sort of tension in between the local churches and Vineyard USA. Before we get into that, I would love for you to talk a little bit about the reorg, because this seems to be sort of Vineyard USA's sort of response to not only Duluth, but Anaheim and all these other situations that they're not real happy with. And so what is the reorg? What does it entail? Did the local pastors, such as yourself, have any say in the changes that are being proposed? And what does this really mean for each individual, allegedly autonomous church?
Right. Well, it is. So we've heard a steady stream over the last, since Jay became the national director, we have heard him say, and we have heard said from the national conference stage that autonomy is not a good thing, and autonomy is the root of a lot of our problems, which is even how they frame it is a gross, misunderstanding of what autonomy means. But it's become a convenient place to lay all of our blame, and to suggest that if we didn't practice the autonomy that we've practiced since we started, that we wouldn't have these problems. And it's just bears no connection to reality whatsoever. I've tried to point out personally to Jay that, we live in 2,000 years of history where there has been a lot of churches where there has been no autonomy, but there has been tremendous corruption. And so that having some kind of an authoritarian or a very strict rule does not prevent abuse. It doesn't prevent the misuse of authority. And so it's just problematic, and autonomy just becomes a convenient way for us to try to push off blame to our own failure of leadership, our own inability to practice healthy relationship, and to hold each other accountable, and to really through this whole thing, it feels like it's brought to the surface that there is an old boys network that operates within the system of Vineyard USA, and it is alive and well, and it will survive any reorganization attempt. In fact, the reorganization attempt in many ways just centralizes that club. But it is an attempt to It's an attempt to bring some kind of form and structure to something that has largely not had a lot of structure. Coming out of the Jesus people, that was kind of the vibe, though. Like, we don't want to have, it's like, in many ways, it feels like we're becoming that which we left in order to be a vineyard. And now we find ourselves with as much, if not more, hierarchy than the Roman Catholic Church. And in terms of your question about have vineyard pastors had a voice in this, so I think that the answer Vineyard USA would give is yes, absolutely. We've been consultative and we've been transparent. But the reality is that the whole reorg started from a national meeting of leadership, area leaders and regional leaders, and the executive team like years ago now, like at least 6 years ago. And in the document that they shared at that event, it details all of the problems as they perceive them that the vineyard is facing, a kind of an imminent crisis, which is kind of demonstrated in the number of churches we've lost over the last decade. And
So
then
they do track that then.
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Interesting.
And then the thing goes on to really highlight the fact that we really, one of our problems is we don't have ordination. We need more structure. We need to employ more people, so there's greater accountability. So it's telling us way back then how this is going to go. And then lo and behold, after all of the consultation and all of the input from local pastors, it looks exactly like they wanted to look, basically six years ago or more. And so has there been opportunity? I mean, we've had area meetings where we've sat around tables together and 8 or 10 of us are asked what we think about this or what we think about that, and then those answers all get written down and sent in to the home office. But I don't know that there's been anything substantive or meaningful that has been affected by the fact that we've had these conversations. And when we've had to try these conversations, they don't, like when I've personally approached Caleb Maskell or I've emailed with Jay Pathick, the national director, it goes nowhere. There's nothing that develops out of that. And it's not that I feel like they've got to do what I say. That'd be silly. But on one hand, it feels like they continually create the impression in conversation or in publication that we've all been involved in this. And I absolutely know that that's just like a lot of vineyard pastors that I talk to don't feel like we've had any real substantive participation in this process at all. It's not grassroots, top down, not bottom up.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is that there are now one but two reports that came out that had a very clear black and white recommendations in regards to things that are structurally lacking within the vineyard. And there's a lot of crossover. I've read both the Grace report and the Guidepost report, a lot of similar things being recommended. So in light of this reorg, and if we're looking at the two side by side, what has Vineyard done, or what are they proposing to do? I mean, it's been, I think one of the reports came out in 2021. The other one came out, I think, 2022. It's now 2025. Like, where are we at with with some of those recommendations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from my vantage point, it feels like very little has changed. I know that I don't think that that's what Vineyard USA would say. I think Vineyard USA would say that they've pretty well gone right down the checklist and they've got everything sorted out. But we still have no way we don't vote for the national director, really. We can't replace the national director. What we have is a reporting process now. So if you've got an incident of spiritual abuse or sexual abuse, you can call the hotline that's been set up with Guidepost. The problem is then Guidepost just turns around then and passes the thing on to Vineyard USA. And then sometimes that gets passed on directly to the pastor who has been called about. And so it's not a super safe or healthy reporting process. And it doesn't go to anybody who has the power outside of the Vineyard system to actually hold Vineyard USA or that system accountable. So there's no, it's like, it feels like, what's the thing, like the catch and kill kind of a thing, like, okay, we've, you call in this number, now we've recorded your thing, and now, just leave it with us. We'll take it from here. And I don't think I don't think it is from a victim-centered perspective. I don't think that that's been helpful, even though it creates the appearance like something's happened. And when I've asked about some of these things and some of like what's being in place for victims, the conversation almost always turns to how much money has been spent on these systems, how much money has been spent in putting these other things in place. Now, I will say that it's not that there aren't any changes. I wouldn't say that it's not that there aren't actually helpful resources that have been paid for by our 3% giving as local churches that Vineyard USA has contracted with on our behalf. But in terms of structural, substantive changes where a person could actually go to like an ombudsperson, leave a complaint that could then be independently investigated, changes that feel like there's power that's actually being given to local church pastors, those things haven't happened, and it doesn't feel like there's been a substantive change in any respect.
Well, let me ask a dumb question then. So this is me coming from a corporate background.
Right.
My daytime employer is a huge bank. Internationally recognized. And, I look at the structure and the reporting mechanism that is in place. And I mean, from just a statistical perspective, like the amount of things that you guys are required to track and report back to Vineyard USA, from salvations to baptisms. And some of that stuff is obviously very important, and many other churches do it, like attendance and financial health and all that stuff. But there's some things that are sort of subjective, I think, in there.
Yes.
And kind of difficult. They're not as black and white in terms of like, how do we report this effectively? But they operate in many ways. If you look at, and it's not hard to find it. They publish it right on their website on Vineyard USA. You can see the reports from every year, but they operate in you and I have talked about this in very much the same way as a large corporation. And so why not just have an HR department? Hell, even an HR person, that they could hire, who specializes in these sorts of things, and is the place where you route, those complaints to, or those, concerns to.
Fantastic question. I mean, this is a question that I've asked. I don't understand it, other than to say I know that, as a pastor, it's easy to find myself in those kind of situations, those kind of meetings and things where I can take an overconfident view of my capacity to deal with things. I mean, I remember when I first started as a pastor, people would come to me for counseling, and I felt very comfortable with my little bachelor's degree from Bible college, wading into the deepest of their, sometimes mental health issues. And it took me quite a few years to realize, oh, buddy, you're way in over your head. This is not even something you should be playing with. Your greatest resource here is to make referrals to qualified people. But it took me time to get to there. And I think sometimes it's the same thing with HR, that a lot of times as pastors, we think, oh, it's people, it's relationship. But there have been so many missteps, so many public statements that have been made, like just even through the whole Duluth controversy, the conflict, that could have easily, like if they had just had an HR like a professional HR person, just would have saved all of us so much time and trouble, and so many, I think, times where a qualified HR person would have been able to say to them, hey, that may be legal, but it's not wise. It's definitely not best practice. And I think it would have saved a lot of grief. So yeah, I think that would be the best investment that, as an organization, that Vineyard USA could make, would be hiring a couple professional, qualified, from outside of the system HR people.
Yeah, agreed. And it's funny that you mentioned what you just said, because I was talking to a friend of mine last night, who's a therapist, and we were just talking about the fact that it so often, these poor pastors are put in situations where they're expected to do things that they weren't trained in seminary to do, and so the kind of the joke is, the best ideas that pastors ever have come and stay while they're in seminary, because once they take their first church, then they're running a business. And so, and they're expected to know how to run a business. And it's like, they don't teach you that in seminary. They don't
That's
give you
right.
business courses, like,
Yeah.
so it's kind of interesting. But one of the things that I found interesting is John Kluwer's telling me a little bit about this. And so I wondered if you had some thoughts on it as well. I was not aware that there's kind of we'll say a spectrum of different types of agencies that you can contract to come in and perform an investigation. And so one of the questions that came about very early on, and I'll tell you, I don't know if I ever told you this, but the whole reason I came to kind of look into this whole situation before I even knew what had occurred in Duluth is because here locally in Columbus, Ohio, there's a huge presence. There's probably 7 or 8 vineyard churches, including the big mega one, in Westerville, but there's vineyard churches in every neighborhood here. Huge presence. And so my contact with the vineyard, I've gone to 3 different vineyards probably here over the years, including the big one, have become friends with numerous people throughout the vineyard, some still in it, some not, some have left for various reasons. But my ex-wife, who I'm still very friendly with, had an incident when she was 21 where she was sexually assaulted by someone in her small group, and did the right thing, went to the leaders in her small group, and it was very much the opposite of what they probably should have done, which is go to law enforcement. Instead, it was a lot of gaslighting. He's got a drinking problem and we just need to get him help. Why were you even out with him anyway?
Right,
He has a
right.
girlfriend. You shouldn't have been there. And so for decades, this happened, 20 some years ago now. She's gone to therapy, has had issues as a result, obviously.
Obviously, yeah.
And so fast forward to a few years ago or a couple years ago, she's chatting with me and says, can't believe this, but Vineyard is hiring this third-party organization to come in called Grace to do an investigation. And it's into a number of different allegations at different vineyard churches throughout Columbus. So this is what I was aware of at the time, that they caught wind of her situation, so they were going to bring her and talk to her. They caught wind of some allegations with the worship leader at the big vineyard. Another situation at one of the vineyards we went to with a pastor and that pastor's child. So they were looking at a bunch of different things. And she said, it seems really great because they said, we're going to look into all these things. We're taking it seriously. And at the end, there will be some sort of justice, and probably they will supply counseling as well. And so I thought, that's awesome. This is great. You should definitely do this, And so she went in and gave her story and ripped those Band-Aids off and reopened those wounds and went through it. And only to be told at the end that the report's finished, but they're going to throw it in the trash can. They're going to bring in this other group and redo the whole thing. And you're more than welcome to come in and talk to them. And by this point, she's like, no, I'm not doing this again on this promise that you haven't delivered on.
Right.
And so I'm sure she's not the only one who was like, fit it, And so I started taking a look into it. And my first question was, well, that's odd. You just paid, I don't know how much money for Grace to come in and conduct this investigation. The report's out there, it can be found. And it has some very serious things that they said you need to fix. But then why would they just dump that and then hire this other group? What's the motivation there? And so John was telling me that it partly seems to do with the fact that there's a wide array of different groups that can come in, and the level of control that you have over the final report.
Exactly.
Yeah. So my long way of saying
Yeah. Well, that's the reality. And I think one of the challenges for anybody who's a victim, anybody who is a survivor of abuse, to have exactly that scenario happen where you're asked to come in and tell your story again. Like you say, you reopen that wound only to find the trauma that you've experienced multiplied by the response that you receive in those settings where, I've heard them say to me, oh, well, the report is inconclusive, to a Grace report in one of the Vineyard churches. Well, there's nothing inconclusive about it. They acted as if, or it felt like what they were saying was, well, this doesn't say that the person was guilty of doing these things. Well, that doesn't, there were only 2 people in that room, so they can't, it's not like a legal court where they're going to render a verdict. That's not their nature. That's not what they do. What they're saying is we have every reason to believe the reporting victim, and they have everything to lose by telling their story. But we also think that, there's some pretty dodgy things about the story that the perpetrator, reported perpetrator, has said, and the inconsistencies. And so, we think clearly that the reporting victim is telling the truth and should be paid attention to, and, like you say, should receive counseling and all those things. But that's Grace. And Grace is running an independent investigation, and they're going to publish independently their findings. You have other groups like Guidepost that Vineyard USA is contracted with on many of these things. Guidepost is working for you. Guidepost is going to let you determine what information is shared and what information is not shared. They're going to allow you to determine the scope of the investigation, the things they can get into, the things they can't get into. And the convenient aspect of that then is you can step back at the end and say, oh, no, we had this Guidepost in investigation and this is what they did. And there is truth to what you're saying, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that you had a whole great big map of the United States and you said you're allowed to look inside of Illinois, but that's it. You can only look inside of Illinois. And so while there might be 49 other stories out there, that's not in the scope of this report. All you're reporting on is what happened right here in this one spot. And so it really and it's not the only time that independent people have been contracted in other instances to do investigations where they clearly were employed by Vineyard USA, which is just not an independent investigation. When you're hoping to get another contract with them further down the road, you're no longer just telling us what happened, right? You're telling us the best version of what happened in those instances. And so, or you're likely to tell us, the version that is going to put them in the best possible light. Because there's money that's connected to it. There's employment that's connected to it. And so finding something that creates more independent boundaries, even though they may still have, like Grace may still have received a check from the church or a check from Vineyard USA. It's with very clear boundaries that you're going to pay us at the end of this, but you're not going to have control over the outcomes of this. And so I know of, instances where either Vineyard USA used their own people, trustees and super regional leaders to do investigations in church situations, or they contracted with people to do investigations who were contracted by Vineyard USA and who were people who indicated to some of the people involved in the investigation even that they were hopeful for future employment through Vineyard USA.
Wow, it sounds like a great idea for PR, but not so great for victims.
That's right. It's definitely not victim-centric in any way.
So talk about a little bit about, we touched on this a little bit before we started recording, but sort of this tension that feels like it exists now between sort of the local church level and Vineyard USA, because if you look online, there's a very clear difference of opinion between the ways in which things were handled in Duluth post Gatlin's and the ways in which Duluth Vineyard Vineyard USA has chosen to handle it. In fact, they both have statements on their websites.
Right.
And they both have timelines on their websites. And Vineyard USA has publicly stated that they're not super happy with the fact that Duluth has chosen to essentially publish everything on their website. They've got back and forth conversations between them and Michael and Brenda Gatlin, between them and members of Vineyard USA. So there's a lot of information out there. They've been ultra transparent, I would say, at least from the outside perspective. Vineyard USA not real happy about that, and they've kind of seemingly said, hey, we told them not to do this. This may not be, they may have gotten some of the facts wrong, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I've been accused by Vineyard USA of spreading misinformation, based on Well, so that's where it gets a little bit tricky. I don't have clarity on exactly what misinformation I'm supposed to have passed on, just the general accusation of misinformation with a request from myself and from the leadership of my church for the specifics on that we haven't really received yet. And it's been a couple months. So, yeah, wow. Yeah, so we have definitely found ourselves in a place where there are competing narratives that are going on. And again, part of the tension that comes from that is people kind of like the target audience, if you will, being vineyard pastors. The amount of time that vineyard pastors have to actually go through the material is fairly limited. There also are circumstances in which, for some vineyard pastors, they know the people directly involved and they are confident in what they know about that person being enough. That, hey, these guys are good guys, these people are good people, they wouldn't do anything underhanded or they wouldn't do anything, inappropriate. They wouldn't say anything that wasn't true, and making statements like that without actually wading into the documentation. You can literally read things that people said and did in their own words. So it's not like, here's an opinion I have about what happened. It's more like, well, here's the email that person sent, and it doesn't line up with what they said the day before in this email. And so these can't both be true. These two things can't be true at the same time. We're willing to, I don't even know the right word, but we're just willing to set aside just the simple look at these these documents that clarify things pretty specifically. And again, it's, when you know somebody and you know that they would never do. I mean, we just had coffee the other day and they were so encouraging and we had such a great time together. I just know that they just wouldn't do anything. Well, wow. Like that's, I mean, I have a good friend and I don't mean, I'm not making this as a comparison. I want to say that, but I have a good friend who in Canada who worked for a charitable organization there, and they went to a big national conference for that charitable organization. He was in a conference meeting with the spouse of another couple that were there, the wife of a couple that were there, and then my friend's wife stuck around with that woman's husband, who was an officer in the military and was a very nice guy, and they had a lovely conversation together. And then a couple of weeks later, it turned out that military officer was actually a serial killer in Canada that just came to light, was finally caught. So, the reality is we can have really lovely coffees with people and really warm conversations, and we can come away from meetings with people feeling like they just are so sweet and genuine and encouraging. As one vineyard pastor said to me recently, he said, when you're on the inside, you get one version of a person. That when you are no longer on the inside or you're no longer going along with things, you encounter a completely different version of the same person. And he said it's really hard for me to explain to people how that can happen, how that can be. But that was his experience with Michael. And I have other friends who their experience with him in small groups was like really warm and very encouraging. And we think, well, they can't both be true, but they can both be true. We can have people who really have some serious issues on one hand can behave in different settings like they're your best friend.
Yeah, that's absolutely true in a lot of settings. One of the things I wanted to get your take on as well is, we're kind of going back to the two different narratives that are sort of running concurrently. One of the things I just still can't wrap my brain around, I think, are some of the things that seem like they should be intuitive or logical things that should have occurred or should not have occurred. And so when you look at the timeline and you look at the communications, and again, as you said, the emails are there on Duluth's website. So you can read these conversations, this dialogue between Duluth Vineyard, who've got like John Kluwer and some of the folks who are trying to pick up the pieces in the aftermath of this horrible incident. And they're trying to get support from national leadership. And I think it's also important to point out too that they had some different leaders at the time when this first hit. I think it was Phil Stroud was the national director before Jay kind of took over. So there's some different people in positions of power there, but
That's right.
fact remains, there were certain things that are just head scratching that were recommended. And so one of the things is Rob Morgan, and I'm not super sure what his role is specifically, but I know he was in correspondence with like John Kluwer and some of the leadership at Duluth and was saying, hey, and this is after the allegations had come out. And so I think we knew the nature of the allegations, and he's saying, and not once, but he kind of doubles down on the fact that maybe Michael specifically shouldn't be involved in the investigation per se, but he should still be in charge, generally speaking, to help with the healing process, and his wisdom and leadership will be useful. And then at some point, it seems to suggest, or he seems to suggest that they should Michael and Brenda should have some say over whether or not they even hire Grace to come in, because they keep saying in these emails that just let us handle it. Just let us handle it. And I'm like, this is your child we're talking about. Like, in no circumstance in any other company would that even be a question. They would be distanced as much as humanly possible from the allegations. They would bring in other non-related parties to kind of oversee things. You would absolutely hire a third-party investigative group to come in if you don't have an HR department, and you would let law enforcement and HR do its thing.
That's right. Yeah.
How in the world? And it seems to me that the Vineyard USA's kind of response to this has been, in the aftermath of this, has been, well, they were just, you can't blame them. They were just kind of working with the rules as they were at the time. And
Exactly.
I'm like, but that flies in the face of common sense.
Right. Yeah, and that's the whole, one of the things that's been so challenging is that we, that in Vineyard USA on, quote unquote, telling on themselves, refers to this oppressive system that just kept their hands bound from being able to do these obviously right things. And that doesn't even exist. It never existed. There was nothing that prevented them from getting in a car or getting on a plane and going to that location and saying, hey, like, this is messed up. This is not how we're going to do things. This is inappropriate. Now, for sure, they had no legal authority over them. They couldn't do anything if the Gatlins had said, well, screw you. We're going to do this the way we want to do it anyway. Well, sure. Okay, fair enough. But Brenda was employed by Vineyard USA. She was an employee of Vineyard USA. So they had employment power over her. Michael was a trustee of Vineyard USA. And so there was institutional power that they had over him. So they in fact had more authority over both of those actors in this situation than they generally do over pastors of local churches. And they chose not to use any of that power to do the obviously right thing, in part because of which Rob says in one of the documents in the guidepost report, I think it's included in there, that, he made some, mistakes in judgment because of his relationship with Michael. And Jay says, essentially seems to say the same kind of things, that there was, this relational connection. And so maybe that wasn't, he didn't always do the thing he would normally do. Wow. If my son, if I go over to his house to visit with him and his family and I see his wife has bruises, there's a conversation we're going to have, right? It's just, you don't go, well, that's not good for anybody. And so it's a really strange situation. I know that when you love somebody, you want to believe in the best. And I get that. But when you're a part of an institution, you have a responsibility. And that responsibility means that even the best of friends, even family members, you have to stop. You've got to recuse yourself from decision making. You've got to bring in people who are going to be objective and who can have the power to make the right decisions. And I don't know how a person becomes the national director of a movement like the Vineyard without having that straw of kind of basic common sense already there.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I noticed too, a couple things I want to ask your thoughts on. One of the other things I noticed too is that there seems to be a lot of situations in which there are churches within the vineyard that are sort of co-run by a husband and wife duo, which is sort of interesting to me because that seems like a terrible idea. I'm just gonna say,
Can
seems
be.
like a bad idea. I'm sure there are instances where it works and works beautifully, but in general, there's an example that I know of here in town, and I know this because I had a friend who was an assistant pastor there who was on staff and would report to me that there were times where he would say like they would just have a couples fight in front of us, and he's like, I just took time out of my schedule. I'm not paid to be here. And so if you guys are just going to do this, I'm leaving. And then you hear reports of the same thing happening with Michael and Brenda Gatlin, and talking to Chris Souter, he would recount numerous occasions where, they would get into a fight. Brenda would leave in tears. And this is not completely uncommon. And there are reasons why there are rules in place in companies. No company I've ever worked for, and I've worked for some decent sized companies, would that ever be allowed? But it seems like it's not only allowed, but sort of encouraged within the vineyard. And then we act surprised when bad things happen.
Sideways.
Like, how can you make it a decision objectively about the love of your life? You know what I mean? And so when you have situations like where there are complaints being leveled against Brenda, for example, back in 2014, the report ultimately goes to Michael, and then Duluth years later is like, oh, we never saw that.
Yeah, it never came to us. Yeah.
And then they find out that they just shelved it. Of course they did. Your instinct, I'm sure, is to protect your loved one.
Of course.
Which is why that shouldn't go to you in the first place. But
exactly. Yeah.
Also probably why there should be some nepotism rules in place. And it sounds like John Kluwer kind of saw the future and pushed for some nepotism rules at Duluth that were eventually overridden in order to bring even more family into the picture, Jackson. And so, like, what are the rules, if there are some, within Vineyard, nationally, in terms of family members also being employed? Because that seems like it could lead to major problems, and has.
Yeah, I think it can for sure, and I don't think it has to. I think there are a lot of I don't want to digress from the question too much, except I'll just say that, in the vineyard, we've got this kind of entrepreneurial history. And so for a lot of vineyard churches, they started as kind of like a mom and pop store. And so it was a husband and wife jumping in here together. And sometimes that means the husbands went out and they got a job to be able to feed the family. Collectively, between the two of them, they did some kind of a pastoral sharing of a job more. But yeah, does that create problems? Yeah. And since all this happened in with the Gatlins, there has been a nepotism policy that Vineyard USA has recommended, but that hasn't stopped the fact that our national director, Jay Pathak, is married to one of our associate national directors, Danielle Pathak. And so we can say, yeah, this is a terrible idea, or yeah, we can see how this is problematic, but we've cracked the code and we can make this. And I'm not saying that as a accusation that something inappropriate has happened there. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that it's hard to convince the rank and file that there's a problem when that's exactly what the national director is doing.
The nepotism thing is definitely very, very interesting to me. And, I was talking to my local pastor about just how that sort of thing is structured, and also what the reporting mechanism is for other, denominations that historically have been around longer, and have, probably dealt with things similarly in the past. And so how does that differ from church to church? But that was always interesting to me. I'm like, I've never, I think back again to my corporate life. And if you are even dating someone in the same department, not even married, but dating someone. And of course, they look at how much power does one person have versus the other, and do you have authority over the other person? And they have such a low tolerance for it that I've seen them move people completely out of one department to another, which may sit in a completely different building, across town, just to prevent any potential issues or allegations of things like favoritism, from occurring.
Yeah.
So very, very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I think it's, it's a bit of hubris on our part that we think, we can rise above that, or rise above these, really natural points of conflict and contention that can arise. And again, I would never say that a husband and wife couldn't do ministry together, but it definitely requires a very different setup than what we would usually expect. I mean, we see, on mission fields, husband and wife teams, engaged in foreign fields and stuff all the time. But even there, there needs to be some kind of an opportunity for both people to have some kind of independent reporting that takes place and independent accountability that takes place. Because we just know from experience all the possibilities that can arise in a situation like that.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of things that you something you said kind of triggered, and one of the interesting things was sort of going back to what you were talking about in terms of Vineyard USA and their ability to influence control over a situation like a Brenda and Michael Gatlin, and what they could or could not have done based on what sort of control that they have. One thing that John Kluwer brought up was, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but he mentioned they call it the nuclear option.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that seems like that would have been a great moment to exercise the quote nuclear option, to say that, hey, either you're gonna do right by the victims, we're gonna involve law enforcement, we're gonna bring a third party group, or we take the name. And yet they seem to only use the nuclear option for situations that maybe it's not called for, we'll say.
Right. Not called for. So yeah, for sure. I mean, it is, so I've seen them utilize the nuclear option. And I would agree. I would agree that I have seen them utilize that option in instances, certainly where there wasn't a criminal investigation going on, certainly in situations where there weren't, these very heartbreaking kind of allegations of abuse, both spiritual abuse and sexual abuse that were being reported. I mean, that's part of the whole impetus behind the reorg, is that they want to basically eliminate the need for the nuclear option, because that's all they've had, or that's what they have felt. That's what they say they have had. That's not the only thing they've had. It's such a tiny imagination to think that the only recourse we have is this nuclear option of kicking a whole church out of the movement. When the reality is, we say all the time, every conference I go to, we're a relational movement. We're a family. Well, you don't do that to family members. You don't just go, hey, you guys can't come to the family reunion this year because you're not in the family anymore because, you voted this way in the last election. You don't do that. And that's not what the definition of relationship or family. And, you can actually go to people. You can do things the Bible way and actually get an appointment with them and sit down with them and break bread and have a conversation and a meal and seek to understand and to be understood. And when somebody's behaving really badly, then you say, hey, look, here's the deal. You need a time out, and we're going to, help you out through this time. But we got to get to the bottom of this. And if you're not willing to do that, then we're going to have to go to all your friends that we know, and we're going to have to let them know that you need a timeout and you're not willing to take it. It just doesn't, it doesn't hold water to say that there was no choice but a nuclear option. But that's part of the reorg, is to avoid that. So their hope is that they're going to be able to jettison senior pastors, but retain churches in circumstances where somebody has behaved badly. But generally that behave badly it seems like the definition of that is that you're not towing the official line, rather than you've done damage to a lot of people. So that's really concerning. But I think the important thing is it's never been true that in our prior, less structured existence as the Vineyard, If there was an issue when Wimber was alive, you just get a call from John, and you might have a sit down with John, and there have been lots of contentious relationships since the Vineyard began inside of the Vineyard. It's not like this is a new thing. But to say that there's just that one option, which is often repeated, is not real. Like it's not real life. It's just really, it's like a way of saying we want to make this person do what we want them to do. And the only way we can make them do it is we've got this nuclear option. But I think love is actually more effective than that. That if we really are moved by love in our relationship with each other, I may have been really, I may have treated my wife really badly. And if you come to my door and you sit at my table, I think there's a lot greater chance I'm going to repent of my behavior towards her in that meeting with you than I am if you say we're going to kick your church out of the Vineyard. Like it just seems like such a harmful way to try to exact your will rather than to see what love can do.
Yeah, and that feels like sort of the method that they've used historically, especially with the people I've spoken with who have pulled their churches out of the Vineyard because they wanted to become the test study for being a fully affirming church, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it feels like not only are they not having a chance to sit down and have dialogue, and it goes back to Ken Wilson even. He thought, naively so, maybe, I think he would probably say,
yes,
that he was going to have an opportunity to sit down and present his thoughts. And this is why my feelings on the matter have evolved. And this is, and presenting his position paper. And he was quickly and quietly just kind of ousted.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
So it's interesting. The last question I have for you, this is something that seems to have come up as a common thread too. So one of the things I'm doing a lot of is kind of comparing the situation, or I should say the lead up to what ended up happening in Duluth in regards to sort of the red flags that were there surrounding Michael and Brenda specifically, and the allegations made against them. And then also the Scotts, who eventually sort of hijacked the Anaheim church. And it's eerily similar in terms of the things that they were accused of. And the fact that there has been reporting that goes back not just a year or two, but like in some cases,
way back.
Yeah. And how the common thread between them, besides sort of this abusive sort of relationship that they had with their staff, is that they were both very, very numbers driven and results driven.
Yep.
And it was like growth at all costs. But that seems to be something that is highly rewarded.
Yes.
Within the Vineyard. So if you're putting butts in seats and you're growing, then you're a rock star and you get invited to the special party.
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've got a place for you on the team. Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's like the reality, like it was really difficult at the time, like when Caleb and Jay met with the Scotts, and then they reported to all of us very quickly after that the Scotts were withdrawing from the Vineyard. And then we started talking about, kind of the differences that Alan had. It was a lot of pearl clutching that it made no sense, because if you had been listening to Alan, not just since he'd come to Anaheim, but even while he was still in Northern Ireland, there was Alan never lied in terms of this is Alan was Alan all the way through. And I'm not saying that I'm a fan, or I'm not saying that he didn't take a church out of the Vineyard, that he had no business taking the church out of the Vineyard. But if you were tracking it all with who Alan was and what he preached about and the way he was approaching things, then there are no surprises there. Just none. He acted as his authentic self all the way through that story. I knew stories about Alan from when he was in Northern Ireland and the things that happened with people there. And I had people who were in Alan's, either in his church or for a time in his church, who both told me stories about him admiringly and told me stories about him condemningly, And these people, were really reacting to the same circumstances, the same time period, but it was, Alan he grew that church and he made these things happen. And so hurrah for Alan. And I want to do what Alan did. But then as soon as he took Anaheim out of the Vineyard, then all those Vineyard friends who had sung his praises got very quiet because they realized that was no longer it was no longer cool to praise Alan, even though we'd been platforming him like weeks ago, right? Like even in the original statement that Jay made, it was like, yeah, we went to offer Alan and Catherine a spot, in our leadership somewhere. And I was like, dude,
bad
where's
idea.
the discernment here? Like, what are the choices we are making?
Well, what's interesting too, and this would be a whole separate podcast rabbit hole to go down. But when I was looking into that story, and man, that one's been hard to get firsthand witnesses to come on about, which is interesting. I'm at least trying to get, as opposed to just, regurgitating the news, but it's an important story to tell. But regardless, what's interesting to me is as Alan sort of takes the senior leadership job, which apparently he had professed to having no interest in before.
No interest at all. No, just the Lord led us to move here to Anaheim.
Yeah, which is a whole nother thing, by the way. I want to talk about that real briefly because I realize I'm sucking up a lot of your time here. But the spiritually loaded language that both he and Michael seem to use, where again, it comes back to what you mentioned about sort of hubris, where they're sort of saying, well, God told me to, which kind of shuts the conversation down very quickly. If you're saying, well, God told me directly that this is what we should be doing,
Yep.
regardless of how you feel about it.
That's right.
It's a conversation ender right there.
Yeah, and that's one of the big things. Like when I came into the Vineyard, one of the things that I loved about the Vineyard so much was that I was taught that in the Vineyard, we don't play the Jesus juke. We never say, the Lord told me that we're going to do it this way. Because it takes everybody's choice away from that. It robs everybody of their autonomy. And now we've got to do this because, the Lord has told us to do it. And so, in that situation in Anaheim, you had a lot of dynamics there. You had a pastor, Lance, who had been there for a long time and in many ways had sort of overseen, shepherded the decline of Anaheim Vineyard from a really large, vibrant congregation that was like on the map, right? It was, let's go to Anaheim, to now like a small, like one of the smaller churches. I shouldn't put it that way, but it was like significantly smaller than it was. But you also had young people had gone to other churches, and there was a real sense of, people my age looking around a mostly empty room saying, hey, what happened to the glory days? Remember the glory days? And we'd tell stories and how awesome it was. And why can't it be like that? Well, it's the senior pastor, John brought him in and that's what we need. And I've heard the same thing said about Vineyard music, oh, we don't have any good songs anymore because nobody comes to hear our songs. And it's nonsense. It's a misunderstanding of how the Vineyard grew to begin with and the cultural context in which it exploded. But then you have Alan, who comes on the scene, even though Lance has already picked a successor. You've got Alan come on the scene who doesn't want to be there, but the Lord led him to Anaheim for some reason. And sure, if you're insisting you want to put his name in the hat for senior pastor, he'll let you do that. And then, a few other names get thrown in, even though there has been a successor. But Alan is like, if you've heard any of his rhetoric from the beginning, it's like, we're going to have a revival. We're going to bring young people in. We're going to take this city for God. It gets everything that if you were my age or older, you remember from the glory days. You remember the Sunday night in the gymnasium where everybody's laid out on the floor. Like, that's what we want to get back to that. Like, let's go. And Alan's going to take us there. And then that's not where Alan takes you. But it is that, that charismatic expectation we have that we can muster all that up again. And we want to get that back and be able to hand off to our children this beautiful legacy of a full building and, the world turning to the Vineyard for music and teaching and all those things. And having a hard time accepting that those aren't the days that we're living in anymore.
No, and it's interesting because Alan clearly is attempting to build a product, there because
Yeah.
one of the first things he does, it seems, is he hires this, this famous worship leader, Jeremy Riddle, who comes from Bethel, which is a whole another podcast, um, and some of the leaked recordings from former people on staff there are just it almost sounds like a cult when you're listening to it.
For sure.
They're judging body types and only hiring certain body. It's very weird. And Jeremy is a huge part of that and sort of forcing out people that they didn't feel sort of shared their vision for the future, which was all about, as you said, getting more bodies into the building again and having this explosion of growth, which, to his credit, they've had. Now they're called, I think, Dwelling Place.
Dwelling Place.
But it feels like the plan all along was probably for Alan to create his own movement.
100%. No question. Yeah, when he wasn't asked to be the next national director of Vineyard USA, then it was time to start his own thing.
He was applying for that?
I think in the same way he applied for Anaheim, he was.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, Brian, I really appreciate it. This is super helpful. And like I said, May is looking like the time when this will finally all start to come out. But appreciate all the folks that you've connected me with. And, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. I think it's important for people to hear the story and hear from other people about what's going on. And hopefully it'll penetrate and people start to ask more questions and realize that maybe everything is not the way that we've been led to believe it is.
Yeah, that's kind of my goal is, if anything, if it helps push along change for the people that I love who are still actively involved in Vineyard to make it a better place for them, then that's great. But we'll see what happens.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.